January 17, 1942, somewhere in the dense jungle fringe of New Guinea. The air hangs thick with humidity, and the smell of scorched metal cuts through the wet earth and crushed vegetation. American engineers kneel in the mud beneath the fractured wing of a Japanese bomber, their hands tracing the riveted seams of its fuel tanks. The aircraft, a Mitsubishi G4M, though they do not yet know its designation, lies crumpled at the edge of a clearing, its once proud fuselage now a skeletal monument to violent descent. One engineer pries open an access panel with a crowbar. The metal peels back easily, almost too easily. He reaches inside, expecting the dense webbing of self-sealing liners, the thick rubber bladders that line every American fuel cell. His fingers find only bare aluminum, cold, thin, exposed. He pulls his hand back and exchanges a glance with his companion. Neither man speaks, but both understand. This is not armor. This is not protection. This is a flying coffin wrapped in the thinnest shell imaginable. Halfway across the world, in the quiet corridors of the Naval Technical Mission offices in Washington, intelligence officers would soon receive detailed photographs and typed reports from that muddy field. They would study the measurements, cross-reference the weight calculations, and compile their findings into classified folders stamped with red ink. But long before the bureaucrats could catalog the discovery, the men on the ground already knew. They had found something that would redefine their understanding of their enemy, not as invincible warriors descending from the heavens, but as men sent into battle inside machines designed with a calculus of sacrifice that American minds struggled to comprehend. The bomber they examined was known to the Japanese as the Rico, the Type 1 land-based attack aircraft. To Allied pilots who encountered it in the skies over the Pacific, it would earn a different name, the Betty. It was sleek, fast, and possessed a range that seemed almost supernatural. In the early months of the Pacific War, Betty bombers struck across vast oceanic distances, appearing over targets that should have been far beyond enemy reach. They sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser Repulse off the coast of Malaya in December 1941, a catastrophic demonstration of air power that shattered the illusion of naval supremacy. They ranged from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, from the Philippines to the Coral Sea, carrying torpedoes and bombs across a theater so immense that American strategists could scarcely believe a land-based bomber could cover such distances. The Betty seemed to defy the known limitations of aviation engineering. It could fly farther, strike harder, and return home when other aircraft would have run dry over empty ocean. But that range came at a price, and on that humid morning in New Guinea, American engineers began to understand exactly what that price was. The Japanese Navy had conceived the G4M in the late 1930s, during an era when Japan's military doctrine was being shaped by the vast geography of the Pacific and the limitations of its industrial base. The Imperial Japanese Navy needed a bomber capable of reaching distant enemy fleets and island bases without requiring forward airfields or carrier support. The solution was radical: maximize fuel capacity and range, minimize weight, and accept the compromises such a design demanded. The Mitsubishi design team, led by Chief Engineer Kiro Honjo, created an aircraft with enormous internal fuel tanks stretching through the wings and fuselage. These tanks held nearly 1,800 gallons of aviation gasoline, enough to carry the bomber more than 2,600 miles under optimal conditions. To achieve this, every possible ounce of excess weight was eliminated. Armor plating was reduced to near absence. Defensive armament was kept light. And most critically, the fuel tanks were left unprotected. In American and British bombers, fuel cells were surrounded by layers of self-sealing rubber compounds that would swell and close when punctured by bullets or shrapnel. These liners added significant weight, but they also provided a crucial margin of survival. A B-17 Flying Fortress could absorb devastating punishment, its fuel tanks riddled with holes, and still limp home because those rubber layers sealed the leaks before fire could erupt. The crews knew this. It gave them confidence, a psychological armor as important as the steel plates bolted beneath their seats. The Betty had none of this. Its fuel tanks were simple aluminum shells. When a bullet or shell fragment tore through the thin skin, gasoline sprayed freely into the fuselage and wings. In the oxygen-rich environment of high altitude, a single tracer round could transform the bomber into a fireball in seconds. Allied pilots quickly learned this. They called the Betty the Flying Zippo, after the iconic American lighter, one spark, and it ignited. Veteran fighter pilots spoke of watching Betty formations disintegrate under attack, each bomber trailing black smoke and orange flame as it corkscrewed toward the sea. Some exploded mid-air, their wings folding inward as the fuel vapor detonated in a blinding flash. Others burned slowly, spiraling downward, while the crew, those still alive, faced the choice between staying aboard an inferno or leaping into the empty sky. The American engineers in New Guinea documented everything. They measured the thickness of the aluminum skin, barely more than a millimeter in some sections. They traced the fuel lines running exposed along the interior walls, unshielded and vulnerable. They noted the lack of fire suppression systems, the absence of inert gas pumps that might flood the tanks with carbon dioxide to prevent combustion. One officer drafted a report that would later circulate among training squadrons throughout the Pacific. The enemy aircraft exhibits extraordinary range. Performance achieved through extreme reduction of protective measures. Fuel system is entirely unarmored and highly susceptible to incendiary damage. Crew survivability in combat conditions is assessed as minimal, but the report, clinical and precise, could not capture the deeper shock that rippled through the American ranks as this intelligence spread. It was not merely a technical revelation, it was a moral and philosophical confrontation. American military culture, forged in the industrial abundance of the United States, operated on a fundamental assumption that the lives of servicemen were valuable, that technology existed to protect them, and that no mission was worth sending men into battle without giving them every possible chance to return home. The doctrine was embedded in everything, from the layered armor of tanks to the redundant engines of bombers, from the insulated flight suits to the escape hatches designed for rapid bailout. American engineers obsessed over crew survivability. They added weight, accepted reduced performance, and invested millions in systems designed to bring men back alive. The Japanese calculus was different. It was not that Japanese engineers were ignorant of self-sealing fuel tanks. They had studied captured examples and knew the technology well. It was that the strategic and cultural imperatives of the empire demanded a different set of priorities. The Pacific War was a conflict of distances, and Japan lacked the industrial capacity to produce aircraft in the overwhelming numbers that American factories could generate. Every bomber had to reach farther, strike harder, and accomplish more than its American counterpart. If that required removing armor and protection, then so be it. The pilot and crew were expected to understand this. They were taught that their lives were secondary to the mission, that death in service of the emperor was the highest honor, and that survival was less important than the success of the strike. This was not cruelty in the conventional sense. It was a coherent worldview, shaped by centuries of samurai tradition and the martial ethos of Bushido, adapted to the demands of industrial total war. To the American pilots and engineers who encountered the Betty, this logic was alien and horrifying. One pilot, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, who would later develop the famous Thatch-Weave fighter tactic, described his first encounter with a burning Betty over Guadalcanal. "We hit them and they just came apart. I'd never seen anything like it. Our bombers could take hits and keep flying. Theirs exploded. It wasn't even a fight. It was an execution." And I kept thinking about the poor bastards inside, knowing that their own people sent them up in those things. That empathy, reluctant and complicated, became a recurring theme in American accounts. The realization that Japanese aircrew were not superhuman fanatics, but men trapped in machines designed with their deaths already. Calculated into the mission parameters created a strange dissonance. It was easier to fight an enemy perceived as ruthless and indifferent to death. It was harder to grapple with the knowledge that the enemy's command structure had made a cold, rational decision to sacrifice protection for performance, and that the men flying the Bettys had no choice but to accept this bargain. The symbolic weight of the unprotected fuel tank, that thin aluminum shell holding hundreds of gallons of volatile gasoline, became a lens through which American servicemen viewed the broader ideological chasm between the two nations. In the Bettys' exposed tanks, they saw the distilled essence of a system that valued the collective mission over the individual life. In their own armored bombers, they saw the reflection of a society that, for all its flaws, still placed intrinsic worth on the survival of its citizens. The contrast was not subtle. It was a difference inscribed in metal and rubber, in engineering drawings and weight calculations, in the bodies of burned airmen pulled from the Pacific's warm waters. As the war progressed and more Bettys were captured or shot down, the intelligence became more detailed. Technical manuals were translated, defectors and prisoners provided insights. By mid-1943, American pilots received specific training on how to exploit the Bettys' vulnerabilities. Gunnery instructors taught them to aim for the wings and fuselage center, where the fuel tanks were largest, and to use incendiary ammunition whenever possible. The effect was devastating. Betty loss rates soared. Entire squadrons were annihilated in single engagements. At the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, American and Australian aircraft destroyed a Japanese convoy protected by Betty bombers. Of the attacking bomber force, nearly all were shot down or forced to ditch. The sea was littered with burning wreckage and oil slicks. Survivors spoke of watching their comrades' planes explode before they could even release their torpedoes, the formations disintegrating under the concentrated fire of Allied fighters. Yet the Japanese Navy continued to deploy the Betty throughout the war. There were attempts to improve it. Later models added some armor plating and partially protected fuel tanks, but these modifications were incomplete and came too late. The fundamental design remained unchanged because the strategic imperative remained unchanged. Japan still needed long-range bombers, and it still lacked the resources to produce them in sufficient numbers with full protective systems. The crews continued to fly them mission after mission, knowing the odds. Many kept diaries, and in those private pages, the fear and resignation were palpable. One pilot, Lieutenant Takeshi Maeda, wrote in his journal before a mission to Guadalcanal in October 1942, "We are told the enemy fears our resolve, but I think they do not fear us, they pity us. I have seen their bombers, they are slower, heavier, but they come home. Ours are fast and reach far, but we burn. I do not fear death, I fear dying for nothing, in a plane that could have been made safer, if only there had been the will, or the steel, or the time." Maeda did not return from that mission. His diary was recovered years later by a historian sifting through archived documents in Tokyo. The entry stands as a quiet testament to the human cost of strategic decisions made in distant offices by men who would never sit in a Betty's cramped cockpit, never feel the shudder of machine gun rounds tearing through the fuselage, never smell the sickly, sweet odor of gasoline spraying across the cabin, never face the split-second choice between burning alive and jumping into the void. The American examination of the Betty also forced a reckoning with the nature of technological warfare. In the abstract, war was often discussed in terms of strategy, tactics, and logistics. But the Betty made it tangible. It was a physical object that could be touched, measured, and understood. It was evidence that could be photographed and catalogued. And it revealed a truth that many found disturbing, that modern war was as much about industrial philosophy as it was about courage or skill. The outcome of battles was increasingly determined not by the bravery of individual soldiers, but by the decisions made in factories, design bureaus, and procurement offices. The Betty's lack of fuel protection was not a failure of Japanese engineering, it was a success, in the sense that the engineers had achieved exactly what they were asked to achieve. The failure, if it could be called that, was in the strategic doctrine that demanded such a design in the first place. This realization spread slowly through the ranks of American military leadership. It was discussed in after-action reports and intelligence briefings. It was debated in the halls of the Pentagon and in the ready rooms of aircraft carriers. Some saw it as proof of the superiority of American values, a vindication of the belief that a society that valued individual life would ultimately prevail over one that did not. Others saw it as a warning. If the enemy was willing to accept such horrific loss rates in pursuit of their objectives, then the war would be even longer and bloodier than imagined. The kamikaze attacks that emerged in the final years of the war seemed, in retrospect, a logical extension of the same philosophy that had created the Betty. If the aircraft itself was expendable, why not make the pilot expendable too, and turn the entire machine into a guided missile? The symbolic fuel tank, that bare aluminum shell, recurred in the personal accounts of American servicemen long after the war ended. Veterans remembered it in memoirs and oral histories. It became shorthand for the entire experience of fighting Japan, the sense of facing an enemy whose motivations and values seemed fundamentally alien, whose willingness to endure suffering exceeded comprehension, and whose technological choices reflected a worldview that defied American assumptions about rationality and self-preservation. One Marine veteran, interviewed in the 1980s, recalled seeing a downed Betty on a Pacific island in 1944. "We walked through it, looking at everything. I kept thinking about how we would never send our guys up in something like that. It wasn't just about winning or losing, it was about what kind of country we wanted to be. They built their planes to go far and hit hard, even if it meant the crews didn't come back. We built ours to do the job and bring our boys home. That difference mattered. It still matters." But the story of the Betty was not only about victors and vanquished. It was also about the engineers and designers who created it, men like Kiro Honjo, who lived with the knowledge that their creations had become death traps for thousands of their countrymen. After the war, Honjo rarely spoke publicly about the G4M. When pressed, he defended the design in technical terms. It had met the Navy's specifications. It had achieved unprecedented range. It had performed its intended role. But those who knew him said he carried a quiet burden, a recognition that engineering is never neutral, that every design choice has moral consequences, and that the pursuit of performance without regard for human cost is a Faustian bargain. The captured Bettys that survived the war were studied extensively by American engineers and aviation historians. Some were shipped to the United States and subjected to exhaustive testing. The data gathered contributed to post-war developments in aviation safety and fuel system design. Ironically, the lessons learned from the Betty's vulnerabilities helped shape the protective systems in the next generation of American bombers and commercial aircraft. The knowledge purchased with the lives of Japanese airmen became a foundation for advancements that would save countless others in the decades that followed. In the immediate aftermath of the war, as Japan lay devastated and occupied, the Betty became a symbol of the nation's hubris and desperation. It represented the gap between ambition and capability, the tragic consequences of fighting a war without the resources to sustain it, and the willingness of the military leadership to spend lives in pursuit of strategic objectives that were, in hindsight, unattainable. The Japanese public, confronted with the full scope of their losses, saw the Betty not as a triumph of engineering, but as an indictment of the decisions that had led them into a catastrophic conflict. Yet for the American servicemen who had fought against it, the Betty remained a more ambiguous symbol. It was the enemy, deadly, dangerous, and responsible for the deaths of many Allied personnel. But it was also a reminder that the men inside those burning planes were not monsters. They were sailors and aviators, many of them young, some barely out of school, who had been handed a mission and a machine and told to fly into the teeth of overwhelming opposition. The lack of fuel protection was not their choice. It was something done to them by a system that valued their sacrifice more than their survival. The Pacific War was filled with such contradictions. It was a conflict fought with industrial precision and primal savagery, where technological sophistication coexisted with brutal close-quarters combat, where strategic bombing campaigns obliterated cities while individual soldiers fought for survival in fetid jungles. The Betty, with its elegant lines and fatal flaws, embodied these contradictions. It was a beautiful aircraft, sleek and purposeful, and it was a flying pyre that consumed its crews in flames. It was a testament to human ingenuity, and it was a monument to the moral compromises that war demands. As the years passed and the veterans aged, their reflections on the Betty often took on a philosophical tone. They spoke less about tactics and more about meaning. What did it say about a nation that built such planes? What did it say about a war that demanded them? And what did it say about the young men, American, Japanese, British, Australian, who fought and died in skies far from home, over oceans that swallowed their wreckage and left no trace? One American pilot, Major Thomas Lanphier, who claimed credit for shooting down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's Betty in April 1943, wrote in his later years about the strange guilt that haunted him. Yamamoto's plane, a transport variant of the G4M, had burned just like all the others, spiraling into the jungle of Bougainville with the architect of Pearl Harbor trapped inside. Lanphier was celebrated as a hero, but he admitted that he felt no triumph. He had killed a man he respected in a plane that had been designed to be killed. There was no honor in it, he wrote, not because Yamamoto didn't deserve it. He was the enemy, and war is war, but because the whole thing felt rigged. They sent him up in a plane that couldn't take a hit, over territory where we had fighters waiting, and they expected him to survive. It was murder dressed up as combat, and I was just the instrument. That sense of inevitability, that the Betty's crews were doomed before they ever left the ground, was perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all. It suggested that the war had become, at some level, a machine of its own, grinding men into statistics regardless of their courage or skill. The Betty's lack of fuel protection was not an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate choice, made by rational actors pursuing strategic goals, and that choice had a body count measured in the thousands. In the decades after the war, as scholars and historians sifted through the archives and interviewed survivors, a more nuanced picture emerged. The Betty was not simply a bad design or a symbol of Japanese fanaticism. It was a reflection of the constraints and pressures that shaped all belligerent nations during the Second World War. Every nation made compromises. Every nation accepted losses. The difference was in where the lines were drawn, which sacrifices were deemed acceptable, and whose lives were spent in pursuit of victory. The Betty stood on one side of that line, and the B-17 stood on the other. Neither was purely good or purely evil. They were tools shaped by the societies that created them, and they carried within their structures the values and fears and hopes of those societies. The fuel tank, bare, unprotected, waiting to explode, became the emblem of this terrible calculus. It was the point where engineering met ethics, where strategy intersected with mortality, and where the abstraction of war became horrifyingly concrete. To see it, to touch it, to understand what it meant for the men who flew surrounded by hundreds of gallons of unshielded gasoline was to confront the full human cost of the Pacific War in a way that no statistic or battle map could convey. And so the American engineers who knelt in the mud of New Guinea in January 1942, their hands tracing the thin aluminum of a captured bomber's fuel cell, were not merely gathering intelligence. They were witnessing a revelation. They were seeing, in physical form, the difference between a nation that sent its sons to war with armor and a nation that sent them with prayers. They were understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the enemy they faced was not defined by cruelty or barbarism, but by a different set of priorities, a different relationship between the individual and the state, and a different answer to the question of what a human life was worth. That understanding would stay with them. It would shape how they fought, how they viewed their enemy, and how they remembered the war in the quiet years that followed. The Betty, with its elegant wings and fatal design, became more than an aircraft. It became a parable, a lesson written in fire and metal about the choices nations make when survival is at stake and victory demands everything. It was a reminder that technology is never neutral, that design is always ideology made tangible, and that the machines we build to fight our wars carry within them the truths we are afraid to speak aloud. In the end, the Betty was a plane that flew too far, struck too hard, and burned too easily. It was a product of desperation and ambition, of limited resources and unlimited demands. It was beautiful and deadly, sophisticated and doomed. And in its lack of fuel protection, that simple, terrible absence, it revealed the chasm between two ways of waging war, two philosophies of sacrifice, and two answers to the question of what a nation owes to the men it sends into battle. The American servicemen who examined the Betty understood this, even if they could not always articulate it. They knew, in some deep and inarticulate way, that they were seeing not just an enemy aircraft, but a mirror held up to the nature of modern war itself. And what they saw in that mirror was the truth that victory would go not to the bravest or the most skilled, but to the nation that could afford to value the lives of its people, to wrap them in armor and rubber and steel, and to bring them home when the mission was done. That was the lesson of the Betty. That was the revelation in the jungle. That was the knowledge purchased with the lives of thousands of young men who flew in planes designed to burn, and who burned as they were designed to do, and who fell into the Pacific's endless blue, leaving behind only smoke and memory and a question that echoes still. What is a life worth, and who has the right to answer?